Hello, everybody, and welcome. Hello, everyone. I would love it if I could bring you to your seats. One thing you may have noticed is that despite the fact that there's a microphone here, it's not actually amplifying me. It's mostly just broadcasting me out to the wonderful world of Zoom. Hello, Zoom people, and hello, Room people. It's a hybrid event. We're happy to have both of you. My name is Ethan Zuckerman. I am a faculty member here in communication, School of Public Policy, also CICS. I am really thrilled to welcome you today to a talk given by our friend Francesca Tripodi about her book, The Propagandists Playbook. This is a sort of a happy convergence of factors. We've got this wonderful Asian American Digital Politics Research Collective event going on that Jonathan Ong is running. We've had this book talk scheduled for quite some time, and now we have the opportunity to bring the two together, and it really couldn't be better because Francesca's research relates directly to these questions of mis and disinformation, how we know about the world, how political judgments come into play. So I want to welcome you on behalf of the co-sponsors of this event, which include the UMass College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Department of Communications, the Journalism Department, the Initiative for Digital Public Infrastructure. Hey, that's me. And I particularly want to thank Martha Fuentes Batista, who is the main organizer of this event, only able to be with us remotely. But Martha, we love you, and we're so grateful for all the work on this. I am so thrilled to be welcoming my friend Francesca Tripodi. Dr. Tripodi is assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She teaches at the School of Information and Library Science. She is also a senior faculty researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. She's affiliated with the wonderful think tank Data and Society. She's a sociologist, but we don't hold that against her in this communications department. She's got a very deep interest in the relationship between religion, political partisanship, and information seeking. And she's a leading expert on this. She's testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee on the ways in which ideology drives information seeking. And she's the author of this really wonderful book called The Propagandists Playbook. I teach this book, and I teach it for a couple of reasons. I think it is one of the most insightful works out there about this question of how political ideology shapes both how we look for knowledge and how knowledge is shaped out in the world. But that isn't the really important reason. The really important reason I teach this book is this book takes really seriously different ways of knowing about the world. Francesca is incredibly respectful to her subject. She spends a lot of time understanding what it might be to have an evangelical Christian or a conservative view of the world, and to take that seriously while taking it critically. For me, it's a real inspiration for how I do my research and for taking my research subjects seriously. I think it's something that we should all be studying and we should all be learning from. Francesca, it's really a pleasure and an honor to have you here at UMass. Welcome.
Thank you. Wow, thank you for such an amazing introduction. Thank you everyone for having me here. I'm sorry my voice is a little bit off. It's technically spring in North Carolina, surprisingly, so I'm dealing with insane hay fever, but hopefully you can all hear me okay. So thank you for that fantastic introduction, Ethan. That was really wonderful. Before I get started, I want us to do just a quick hand poll. How many people in this room know the name Nellie Orr? Okay, a few, small. Okay, great. We'll get to that later. But before we do, just like exactly what Ethan said, my name is Francesca Tripodi. I actually don't consider myself a misinformation scholar. I look at how socio-technical systems are violated and exploited. And I think about the way culture and society intersects with information systems. So in addition to platforms like search engines, I'm also studying things like Wikipedia, and I studied that app Yik Yak, which you all may remember from like a bajillion years ago. But and I'm here at, not here, I'm at down south in UNC-Chapel Hill. And I recently wrote a book, so thank you very much, Jonathan, for letting me borrow this copy, about how search engines are manipulated for political gain. And I want to make it clear, this is not an opinion piece. This is rooted in a lot of ethnographic and quantitative work. So how did I do my research? Well, first and foremost, I embedded myself inside two Republican organizations. So I had the opportunity to sit in on a chapter of a women's National Republican group and a college Republicans group. And I went to their bi-monthly meetings. I went to their backyard barbecues. We went to election night gatherings. We polled for candidates that they were super excited about. I sat at tabling events. I went to their Bible studies, and I was able to get a deep understanding of the important things that were happening in their lives. I supplemented this ethnographic observation with in-depth interviews with people who were either part of these groups or whom I met at these group events. So I conducted 30 in-depth interviews and also one focus group with women and men ranging in age from 18 to 70. I also conducted virtual ethnography. So I don't have a personal Facebook account. I set up one for this project. And then as part of the informed consent process, during my interview, I asked if I could friend those that I interviewed on Facebook. And allowing me to do so, let me follow the news and information that they liked, shared, or commented on after the after the interview was over. And finally, I supplemented ethnography with a new methodological technique I refer to as media immersion. So ethnography is about embedding yourself in a physical space, but often sociologists and anthropologists don't consider how media environments are intimately connected to the way people see the world. So a lot of the news and information sources that interviewees identified as trustworthy sources of news, I was not familiar with. And so for 4 months, I obtained all of my news and information from those sources that they identified, while simultaneously refraining from the news and information that I normally digest on a regular basis. And it was through these newscasts, podcasts, radio, and digital first that I was able to really get a deep understanding of the narratives that were happening, and also identify a lot of fantastic cyclical things that we'll get into in this talk. After I pulled myself out of media immersion, I did a more robust content analysis of the transcripts of those podcasts that I was listening. And then I'm a grounded theorist. So I triangulated these data points. I allowed the data to speak for itself. And then through these conceptual categories, I came out with what is my book, the Playbook. So ultimately, what I talk about in my research is that this is a 7-step process. And I'm going to briefly fly through this slide because the talk is walking me through all the steps. So they know their audience, build a network of media sources around this audience, engage with different forms of media literacy. And something that I'm hearing in the fantastic talks that already happened today is how my work could really apply in some of these spaces. And I'm like, super excited to collaborate with everyone that I'm meeting so far. So if you need committee members, like I'm a cool outside reader. Understanding how information system flows. We set the traps through this process of keyword curation and strategic signaling. And then it's a lot of recycling the same ideas over and over again, which I also heard happening today in the presentations. And finally, closing the loop in these acts of self-discovery, right? So engaging people not to really trust elites, but rather do their research themselves. So step 1, know their audience. The first chapter in my book is really contextualizing what does it mean to be conservative in the United States? Because even though I was embedded inside Republican groups, persons that I spoke with did not identify as Republican. They identified, when I asked them open-ended questions, how do you identify? They used the phrase conservative. And so I asked them to explain to me, well, like, what does that mean? What does conservatism mean to you? And I think this quote really sums it up best. Being conservative really goes back down to morals and beliefs. It's about faith, family, the Constitution, and national security. And so these themes arose over and over and over again, both in my interviews and the ethnographic observations. And I came up with what I refer to as the 5 F's of conservatism. And this effectively encompasses faith. Now, it's important to recognize that in the groups I was involved in, this is really Christian faith, and we can definitely talk more about that in Q&A, and I'm looking forward to talking about that more outside of these, the panels today. Family was about reinscribing traditional gender binary roles, right? So there is no such thing as a binary, right? There's only a binary when it comes to family, and also inscribing very heteronormative roles when it came to marriage. Family also encompassed an anti-abortion perspective, right? So this was very much referring to abortion as infanticide. Firearms, this is about very clearly the right to bear arms, right? Limited legislation on regulating guns, the armed forces. And so I cheated a little bit. I put an A in there, but the forces is not only about the military, but so there's very important role that veterans and military play, but forces also mean the police force, right? And so it was interesting because you had a free market, which was about cutting government programming, but actually funneling money into government programming exclusively for the armed forces. So for those that I spoke with, they said that the only role government should play is protecting the people. And so you should be putting all this money into the armed forces and then stripping it from anything else. And we'll talk about who those people are as well. All right. So step 2 was thinking about building a network. So I didn't build this because I'm not a data scientist. This comes from the Network Propaganda book, in which researchers from Berkman Klein Center at Harvard took billions of tweets, right, and mapped the modern information landscape. And I take this concept of a right-wing media ecosystem, and I'm extending it into my book into an information system. So this research very much inspired my own, right? They're talking about how politicians and social media and news networks get together in what they refer to the propaganda feedback loop. But what I wanted to do is also think about how people are part of this process and how this maps onto other platforms, specifically search. So in what ways does Google, and I think that search is often neglected when we're talking about disinformation, how do search engines really amplify this process? And so in what ways is this more of an information landscape than just a media landscape? So by embedding myself in this process of media immersion, I was able to identify 2 central themes that were consistently driven in almost all of the news that I was listening to or reading or watching. And that is that the left is dangerous. And because the left is increasingly dangerous, it justifies this violence against the left. And also that the media is biased. And I could actually do a talk just on this, but I'm going to briefly go through these 7 steps, and then wherever you all want to spend more time in Q&A, we can really get into it. But effectively, they distilled all the news and information around the 5 F's. So faith, family, firearms, armed forces, a free market, and then they distilled these themes around these central ideas, right? The left is increasingly dangerous because they want to get rid of these 5 F's. Okay, so they were colliding these concepts. The media that I immersed myself also really understood that conservatives engage with media in a much different way than I was familiar with. And so I actually refer to this media literacy process as scriptural inference, right? This is a compare and contrast method of focusing in on the word. And it's a study learned in Bible study. But what I think about in my research is that it's not actually just about the Bible. So scripture can be highly transferable. And I learned this firsthand when I was in a Bible study. We were doing the general dig into the text, a very strict literal inerrancy, right? How do these words translate to our life? And then the pastor stepped back and he took out of his pocket this piece of paper in which he had printed out part of the tax reform bill. And he's like, and now we're going to apply this technique to the new tax reform bill, because you can't trust what the media is saying to you about the new tax reform bill. You need to do this research yourself. And then we read like 2 lines of this tax reform bill. And then we thought about how these reforms might influence a local farmer different than a large business person. And so thinking about how this scripture changes, right? And so it actually creates very different interpretations of things that we would consider pretty, I guess I would say, static forms of understanding. So for example, wall of separation. For those of you raised in the United States in a very like traditional school system, what do you think of when you hear this concept, wall of separation? What do y'all think of? No praying in school. What else? Wall of separation. What does it mean basically to you? There's no wrong answer. What does it mean?
No established church.
No established church. The church and government are separate entities, right? And many people think of this as being part of our Constitution. So this,
Back one.
there we go. So this was one of my favorite quotes sitting down with Tom, right? He says, we're talking about separation of church and state. He's like, gets really animated and then apologized for it afterwards. But he's like, talk about fake news, right? Jefferson wasn't talking about keeping state out of church. That's what the wall was about. I challenge you, do a project. Find the language of the law of separation of church and state in the Constitution. The words are not there. And he's right. The word separation of church and state is not, in fact, in the Constitution. And we Googled it together as part of this interview process, right? This actually comes from the Jefferson letter to the Danbury Baptists, in which through a very literal translation of this letter, conservatives have come to an understanding, a justification that it's about protecting the church from government encroachment, but not the other way around, and that church lessons should be heavily involved in the way conservative leaders lead our country. And so in this way, scriptural inference is actually highly transferable. So it doesn't even have to be a sacred text, but there are sacred texts outside of the Bible. So we see this with the Constitution. Pocket-sized constitutions were a huge commodity. Everyone I spoke with had one as part of their like backpack or, you know, in their back pocket. When we did tabling events, Turning Point USA would often provide these small constitutions that then we would hand out at these events. And so we see this, right, in Trump's first impeachment hearing, when those who were very much standing behind what he was saying were creating this drumbeat. Read the memo, right? Read the transcript, read the transcript. And, you know, you saw Trump supporters entering into this game with these read the transcript t-shirts. It was part of MAGA merch in the 2020 election. This was part of a Rush Limbaugh radio show happening during the impeachment trial. And so the transcript, which was actually just a redacted memo, right, released from, it wasn't a transcript of the call, just to be clear, but they were using this very informed literacy process of scriptural inference to justify why the impeachment hearing was in their position not valid. Okay. All right. So how does this matter in terms of the internet? Well, the conspiracy theorists and propagandists that I was looking at have a remarkable understanding of how information flows. And search has become a really ubiquitous part of everyday life, right? We think about it as Google, and I kind of pick on Google a little bit in my book, but actually, I think that's also shifting, right? So we have Siri, we have Alexa, we have ChatGPT, but this search landscape is very much shifting the way we access knowledge. And something that's heavily changed is how information is ordered. So whereas search engines typically used to have kind of a list of links that we would engage in this exploratory process of like clicking through the links, they are now increasingly trying to answer our questions for us. And definitely with the proliferation of ChatGPT, Google's very much moving in this direction. So you see, if I'm questioning how many meters are in a mile, it's no longer providing me a link, right? It's directly answering. Now, if it's just because like I'm a US citizen that has no idea how meters work, like, sure, this is fine. You know, this is what we would refer to in information schools as like a static search. Like, as far as I can tell, this conversion isn't changing anytime soon. Although they recently changed how to do math, so it might change. But as far as I know, that it's going to change very soon. But what I argue in my book is that a lot of what we go to on search is not actually static searches. They collide with what sociologist Arlie Hochschild refers to as deep stories. And I've heard this a lot already this morning. So this is why I feel like very thankful that I'm able to be in this room today. So deep stories are those stories that are like told and retold so often that we don't actually need to hear the whole story to know the moral of the story, right? We only need a few of those words to know the deeper story going on. And I heard a lot of them happening today. So I'm excited to talk with y'all more on these. Most importantly, deep stories are those kinds of stories that feel really, really true, even if they are not particularly accurate, right? And so by engaging with these deep stories, I think about how deep stories are also part of what I refer to as ideological dialects. So not only, and a lot of other researchers have talked about this, not only do we have these kind of unifying deep stories, but the way we conceptualize that deep story is actually very much embedded in how we were raised, how we think about the world, right? So an example could be something like the deep story of the American dream. What that American dream is and the key words around that American dream are going to be very different, right? So you could have an American dream that's embedded in this idea of multiculturalism, right? That's like, oh, wouldn't it be amazing? I mean, we have this America where people can come from wherever and we can learn from their ideas and they can contribute and we can learn and it's like fantastic. Or you can have this like deep story of the American dream that's about picking oneself up by their bootstraps, right? And not engaging in any kind of self-aid, right? Because American dream is about working hard and doing that for yourself. So the ideological dialects very much collide with deep stories. And then this maps onto search. So this is my favorite slide, only because I think we can just take a deep breath. Right, so growing up in the US, I learned from a very early age that the sky is blue. You know, it's part of like saying colloquial sayings. Do I love you? Is the sky blue? You know, of course I do. It's a Crayola crayon, right? It is very much embedded in our culture that the sky is blue. But some pretty awesome textual analysis of things like Homer's Iliad or the Hebrew Bible show us that the sky is not always interpreted as blue. And that this understanding of a blue sky is what we refer to in sociology as a social construction. Now, to be clear, that does not mean like not real. That's like my biggest pet peeve. Social construction just means an agreed upon understanding of how we come to see the world, right? So before the synthetic production of the color of blue, blue doesn't really exist in nature. It's very much dependent on this like synthetic production. And so you didn't see this kind of like blue everywhere until blue started becoming heavily manufactured, right? As part of our culture. And so this though very much maps on to inputs and search engines. So if I'm someone who thinks the sky is blue and I search for the sky is blue, there's like so much great immediate confirmation that the sky is blue. You know, I got these images of a blue sky. That's how I got the image on the last page. In fact, Google's answering my question for me. Why is the sky blue? We've got, why is the sky blue? Or better yet, why is the ocean blue? Okay, so NASA, this is a great source, right? We've got all this information. But if you just change it slightly to the sky is not blue, first of all, you get this band, Lemon Demon, who I don't know. Does anyone know this band? I've yet to find anyone. I'm excited. I hope that through my talks, I'm like somehow providing them some sort of like, you know, awesome coverage, but I have no idea what their song is. So it could be highly offensive. I should actually listen to it just to make sure. But you have this band, but then you also get, what do people also ask? What is the true color of the sky? Why the sky is not blue? The sky really isn't blue. The sun really isn't yellow. And then this fandom page again for the band, we don't know. But these sources are also reputable sources, right? What's fascinating is if we click on these links, we actually come to the same answer, that the sky is not one uniform color. It is dependent on pollution. It is dependent on how the refractals in or how our eyes see refractals in the air. And so our vision's just more likely to see blue than violet. The sky's actually much more violet than it is blue. But you could walk away from these very quick searches, not clicking on any of the information, with two entirely different realities. And what I argue in my research is that this is happening when it comes to politics, right? That ideological dialects shape our keywords and then that shape our searches and our search returns. So think about something like voter fraud. We'll get into voter fraud in a little bit. So if you are someone that thinks that non-citizens should have the right to vote because they pay taxes and they live here, right? You might search for something like non-citizen voting rights, trying to understand what are the laws that could permit non-citizens the right to vote in the United States. But if you're someone whose ideological dialect embodies this idea of fraud, and you're looking for something like illegal alien voter fraud, you are immediately given information which isn't false, right? It's ICE, so it definitely has an agenda, right? But it's not a false form of information. And so it's because of this, these words that work, combating like mis and disinformation and propaganda is so much more complicated than we think. Because why everyday people might not really have an understanding of the mechanics of search, propagandists have a very good idea on how this works. And words that work have been coming around long before the internet, right? So words that work is actually the title of a book published by Frank Luntz. So does anyone know who Frank Luntz is? There's a couple of us. He is like one of the most amazing wordsmithers in the world, right? So he is a Republican strategist who was hired in the early 90s, right? As part of the way that Republicans took over Congress again. And one of his incredible things that he did was focus groups and interviews, right? He found out what do Republican voters care about? And then he wrote a contract about that called the, and he also wrote not a playbook, but like a guide and passed it out in paper to everyone running for office and was like, these are the phrases that we need to use. Many people don't actually realize this, but Frank Luntz created the term climate change as part of that initiative because global warming, according to his focus groups, sounded really scary. And there wasn't really any policy that they were going to work on for it. So he's like, when you get asked about global warming, talk about climate change. Climate change makes it seem like science is still out. Climate change sounds a lot less scarier. And quite frankly, we aren't doing anything policy-wise when it comes to global warming, right? So by creating words and phrases and as a way to shift the conversation, it allows people to think about a totally different way of seeing the same thing, right? It creates this alternative reality. And this maps out really well on the internet, especially in a system designed around keywords and phrases, right? So by signaling to these deep stories and creating new words and phrases around these deep stories, those who are trying to redirect public attention or create alternative ways of looking at concepts can very easily dominate search engine results without any kind of programming language at all. And I refer to these tactics as keyword curation. So this is like creating these concepts around a deep story, and strategic signaling. So this is about tricking search engine heuristics. You effectively create a lot of digital first content around these keywords, and then you flood the zone with this information, right? And that all but guarantees. So this is easy to trick when you center your keywords on what researchers at Microsoft has termed data voids. So data voids is when little to nothing exists online. It means that there's like not very much out there in that information landscape. And so by centering a whole story around these keywords, you can ensure that your information is going to rise to the top. And this is a strategy that Alex Jones used when he was spreading lies right around the Sandy Hook shooting. So, who is Nellie Orr, right? Who is she? Nobody in this room knew. I know how all y'all voted. Okay, so Nellie Orr. Nellie Orr, actually, this is a conspiracy that started on QAnon. Nellie Orr is the wife of Department of Justice Bruce Orr. Bruce Orr was part of the Department of Justice during Trump's first impeachment hearing. Because Nellie Orr was married to Bruce Orr and worked for Fusion GPS, and Fusion GPS also employed Christopher Steele, who created the Steele dossier, which was not right. We know that this whole impeachment is a sham. Nellie Orr became a stand-in for an impeachment sham. So I know this because I wrote about it for Wired, but as I was driving, so now this is a year after my research had been done. I was no longer immersed in these like media environments. And I was driving to work during this first impeachment hearing, and I was listening to the NPR coverage, and Devin Nunes came on and used his opening remarks. And in his opening remarks, he said, we should not be paying attention to this, but what we should be paying attention to is GPS and Nellie Orr. And I almost ran off the road. I was like, am I hearing this? Did I just hear that out loud? Because I hadn't heard her name in like 6 months, right? It is solely discussed within the right-wing information ecosystem. And so by focusing this attention on her, right, and this name, who she's like some random employee at Fusion GPS, she had nothing about her online. It was very easy to create a lot of content around her and then dominate search returns, right? The thing is, though, so with Nellie Orr and the impeachment hearing, this is how it went. But what my research shows is that why this is so effective, why this drumbeat works so well, is by recycling old ideas and making them seem like fresh and new. Okay, so I'll quickly go through this. We may remember what happened on January 6th, 2021. A surprising number of people actually don't, according to a new research project I'm doing. But many people were there under the auspices of a stolen election. The key word that rally was stop the steal, right? Stop the steal, stop the steal, stop the steal. At one point, Google was actually auto-completing stop the with steal, and that was directing seekers to the closest Facebook rally to them, right? In order to stop the steal. But what W.E.B. Du Bois teaches us, and this is from his research back in 1935, so his book, Black Reconstruction in America, what W.E. Du Bois shows us is that this is a tale as old as voting rights. And that after in the 1800s, following their ability to vote, Black men elected a record number of Black men to serve in Congress. And what W.E. Du Bois shows us is that shortly thereafter, lies began to circulate, right? That Black people had abused their voting privileges, that they had engaged in some sort of corruption, and that's why this election outcome had happened, or that they stood generally unfit for democracy. As he says on page 714, because I'm an academic, it's important to cite, he uses the word misinformation. So I think it's really important for us in this field to recognize that Black scholars and scholars in general have been talking about this for quite some time. This happened again, right? The same lie of stolen elections resurfaced in the 1980s when the Republican National Committee created the National Ballot Security Task Force, which was effectively off-duty police officers that would come armed in traditionally Latina and Black neighborhoods. So what my research shows time and again is that disinformation flows along a well-worn and pretty predictable path. And that in order to make these ideas seem fresh and new, they engage in this closing the loop process, or what I refer to as the IKEA effect of misinformation. So business scholars coined this idea, the IKEA effect. It comes from this idea that when people put together furniture themselves, they value it more as a similar piece of furniture, quality furniture, right? I know some people are shaking their heads. They're like, no way. But they show that like when people try to sell it, they like put in all this money, right? For like, I made this, and it's like this amazing table from IKEA, right? And what I argue in my research is that conspiracy theorists and propagandists are engaging in this like same tangible do-it-yourself quality of spreading lies, right? So by encouraging their audiences to go out and do their own research, they make it feel like people are coming to this like idea of self-discovery, but they're actually engaging in much more of a scavenger hunt, right? Engineered by those who are spreading the lies in the first place. Now, I always get this question, and I've decided I just put it in my presentation now because the question annoys me. Doesn't the left also do this? Okay, sure. In some cases, we can see how the left does this. So this is actually an amazing paper by Tarleton Gillespie on Google's Santorum problem. And it shows how Dan Savage effectively renamed a sitting senator, Rick Santorum. And I will let you Google that yourself. We're not going to get into what he renamed him as, but he basically was able to utilize his exceptionally large fan base, his radio network. He engaged in the same playbook, right? He dominated the search returns. He bought the website Santorum.com, and that ended up becoming actually higher in search results than Santorum's own platform page, right? As he's trying to run for re-election. So sure, this playbook can be used by people on the left, right? But as so many super smart people in this room have already talked about, language is about power, and this is about infrastructure and systems. And what the work of Jen Schrady in the revolution that didn't happen tells us, it's a lopsided event, right? So we can't just compare apples to oranges. We have to look at the broader systems of power in here. In particular, we have to look at what I refer to as keyword appropriation. So as my data demonstrates, Oftentimes, keywords are used by very leftist groups, right, to try and push a new kind of agenda, right, to try to push things forward. But that these terms and phrases are often then co-opted by conservative influencers who have a lot of power and money and an ability to dominate those search returns. So right now, kind of the search term du jour that I would show out when it comes to keyword appropriation, abolish the police, is now being used in conservative circles as abolish DEI. And through my research, I was able to partner with a fantastic data scientist. So any data scientists out there, please let me know, because I love to partner with you. And he wrote a script that looked at how the top 10 progressives and the top 10 conservatives used keywords to tag their content on YouTube. And what we effectively found was that progressives are really, really bad at understanding basic search engine optimization, right? And while a lot of them will code their content in very literal keywords, producers of content on the right have a much more nuanced understanding of the messaging that they're actually in conflict with or want to try to usurp. And so we see, right, when you just look at abolish the police on YouTube, one of these top returns, it has way more views, 706,000 views compared to 45,000 or 91,000 or 2.4 thousand, is actually somebody who's very against this idea of abolishing the police and is using a prominent activist and making fun of them, right? Whereas when you look at abolish DEI, all you're getting is the content created by the person promoting abolish DEI. Okay, so sure, the left could do this. But what my research demonstrates is that they aren't doing it effectively well. And those on the right are doing it very, very regularly and have a much more nuanced understanding of how to do this. Okay. So how do we fix it? This is my joke about you never invite a sociologist to the room and then ask how to fix it. We only show you things that are broken and then give this to policy people who could fix it. So technologists, policy people, your ideas. I do think that like fix though is asking the wrong question. So this is why I argue a lot of like fact checking narratives or like simple shifts in code aren't actually going to solve the problem permanently, right? So we can fix things temporarily with these strategies. Those are important parts of the puzzle. They aren't going to solve it, right? We saw this with like Safia Noble's amazing research. Now, when you search Black girls, because of her decades work, good research shows up. But as a paper I just reviewed showed, when you search Asian girls, or when you search Eastern European girls, you are not seeing you are still seeing a lot of those same advertising structures that perpetuate horrifying, systemically racist narratives, right? So if we have a permanent Safia Noble on staff, sure, that'll work. But as far as I can tell, she's not there, right? And they're firing people that do. But they do, these searches can and can be very effective. But it's iterative, it's constant. We need a deeper understanding of these deep stories. I am a white lady that studied conservative US politics. Clearly, there are some smart people in this room that can help us understand what are the deep narratives in other languages that are being perpetuated. How can we look at this in an iterative process outside of a US English primary space? Because disinformation isn't this like bug in a code that we can fix. It's a feature that's being wielded for political gain. And I argue this is a great risk to democracy in the United States, especially right now. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm really excited to connect with you all.
Wow.
Questions?
Thank you.
Thanks.
That was awesome and timely. and giving us plenty of time for questions, all of which is absolutely amazing. Shall I move the mic around the room for questions? Is that the right way to handle this?
We have one here.
You've got one there. So you guys are going to move the mic around the room. Francesca's going to answer for here. We've got probably about 20 minutes for questions, but let me just offer a quick reminder, because we are in an academic setting. I like to remind people what a question is. So a question is an interrogative statement. It ends with a question mark. Sometimes it's indicated by perhaps an upward tone in voice. The distinction between a question and a speech, which often happens in these settings, is that a speech ends with, I guess that's not really a question, it's more just something I wanted to say. Whereas a question is something that theoretically our brilliant speaker could respond to. So I would love it if these could be questions rather than speeches. There's other places for speeches. Anyone have any questions?
A lot of pressure.
Introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Ryan. I'm not actually part of this larger conference. I just came in because I was very interested in the subject. And I remember reading a while ago an article about fake news, quote unquote, factories. And the person who was creating that, interviewed for that article, said that he tried to make both left-leaning fake news and right-leaning fake news. But that left-leaning fake news would often be responded to by fact checks saying this is actually wrong, while right-wing fake news would get spread more easily. And I'm wondering if you encountered this in your research, or if you had any other related observations about that.
This is the Craig Silverman Macedonian misinformation work, where Silverman started interviewing people who were professionally constructing fake news in Northern Macedonia, and basically discovered that there was a massive audience for right-wing fake news, very little for left-wing fake news.
Okay. So I don't have a direct answer. I have a different paper that looked at reopen groups and how fake news spread within those spaces. And one of the things I found was that when content was being flagged as fake within those spaces, it was actually had a bizarre doubling down effect, where those in these groups really didn't trust the fact checkers. So they felt like the fact checkers were biased against conservatism. And so then they would say, well, Facebook flagged this, so now we know it's true. And I was like, that is surprising. And I also, in my research, had a lot of persons tell me they didn't trust things like Snopes because they believed it to be bias. With regards to your question, though, in terms of like, there's like a greater susceptibility, I think part of it, I don't think anyone wants to feel fooled by fake news, really. I do think that there is this problem where people potentially check stuff that they see on social media, and they use the same words and phrases, and then they Google it, and then that's how search works. It like takes them back to that content. And so some of the search literacy stuff that I work on talks about why those terms are so important and how that might break that cycle. I'm not sure if that answered your question. Okay, cool.
Oops.
Oh, wait, we'll get
Wait.
just for the
Half a
Zoom.
second so the Zoom can hear you.
Of course.
And it'd be great if you would introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kavita Rajagopalan, the director of the Asian Media Initiative at CUNY. I'm not a scholar, I'm a writer and a practitioner. We are more community organizers than anything. We are now in the process of, what I'm going to share a little bit more about researching the community media landscape for and by AAPI across the country. And one thing we're noticing is specifically in English language media, that a lot of the exact terminology from right-wing news sources that don't have the same political or historical context are being repurposed inside in community Asian media, specifically in English language sources. So of course, if you try and do Google Translate, I'm not fluent in every Asian language, sadly. So I'm relying on my own, skills and what tools are there, and we know there are gaps. But if you look at the English language sources, so I'm wondering if you can kind of give us a sense, if you've seen anything about how information flows into these communities. Like, for example, why would a Filipino news source be talking about wokeness or, the trans issue in these specific languages, these specific terms?
Yeah. This is such a good question. So first of all, I think this invites actually a lot of great research. So I hope that what I talk about in the very kind of white landscape can be looked at in other landscapes, because clearly there needs to be more research there. And I would imagine, and this is just speculative because I haven't myself researched those spaces. I'm very much limited to the language that I speak, unfortunately. I would imagine something like wokeness transfers pretty well, because it's like stand-in for the hysterical left. And so if you search for something like woke, which is also, by the way, a co-opted keyword, by the way, if you search for something like woke or even social justice warrior, that's another example of a co-opted keyword, or keyword appropriation. It provides you that like avenue into other like-minded content that can help kind of steer the conversation in that way. And I would imagine by using woke, it's because there isn't a direct translatable word. So that's why there's the stand-in. But I don't know, does someone in this room actually have a better answer? Because I would imagine there are better people to ask that question to in this room, not me. It's a really good question. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm Sarah Avle. I'm an assistant professor in the communication department. It's a question that may relate to the previous one. So I was wondering if you found any threads between the conservative groups that you were working with and overseas missionary groups, because say for the WhatsApp groups that are on my on my phone, these things translate through those networks. So it's missionary groups trying to send the gospel out to Africa, and big churches, what do you call them? The really mega churches, thank you, mega churches, where you see sort of the overlap between a certain interpretation of evangelical Christianity and the conservatism that you're describing. So did you find any links on that front?
That's a great question. So I didn't study missionaries. I was studying people here who were very much bound to like the state of Virginia and were super engaged in the gubernatorial race that was happening in 2017. And that's what my ethnographic research was around. But I would venture to say there, and I talk about this a bit in my book, and I compare it to the work of Ruth Bronstein, who has an amazing book called Prophets and Patriots. And she talks about how the Bible can be used in many different ways, right? And that progressives use the Bible a lot as well, but that there are these different styles of engagement with the Bible. And actually, I used her research to help support my concept of scriptural inference, so that while what she refers to as progressives' use of the Bible is engaged in more empathetic listening, those who were conservatives' use of the Bible was much more of a textual inerrancy. And so I think like that concept of scriptural inference is actually what is allowing that leap to take place from place to place, because if your media literacy is bound to like a much more literalist textual understanding, and also I draw on some of the work of Sam Weinberg as well, a historian, that shows that how you read, like, so with inerrancy, it's not just a direct translation of the text that is important or can potentially be problematic. I mean, most academics have a very deep, direct look at a lot of texts, right? I mean, I gave a page number quote while I was doing my research, but I think that what the difference is, at least what I was seeing, is there's not the desire to look at the context or the author in which this text has been written. And so I also draw on the biblical scholar Kane Hope Felder, who was at Howard University. He recently passed a few years ago, but he demonstrates how translations of the Bible based on the location of said missionaries effectively erased Blackness and Africa from the Bible, right? And so if your inerrancy is this translation of a sacred text that has no account of like who wrote it and why, then that inerrancy will be limited, right, in your ability to interpret what they're trying to say and why that's important. So I'm sure that missionaries, I would say there's, again, lots of different kinds of missionaries, but I would imagine if you're seeing similarities between what I talked about in there, it would be because of those literacy practices or those like ways of engaging with the Bible. Did that answer your question?
And just
Awesome.
coming into those two questions and kind of
Sure.
connecting to some research happening at UMass at the moment. Pashemik Grabowitz over in CICS actually has a big paper coming out on looking at how news agendas in different countries and different languages move in sync or diverge from one another. And this is a really hard methodological question because you have to find the same topic being talked about across English and Spanish and Polish. But he's actually got a very clever way of doing it. It actually would probably work fairly well for situations where you have loan words like woke or social justice warrior, where you might be able to find them between the two. And it actually could be very interesting for something like this question of evangelical missionaries going into communities and the possibility of ideological spread within that space.
Could you repeat the name of that scholar, please?
Yeah, his name is Przemek Grabowicz. Unless you speak Polish, there's no way you're going to come up with the spelling of his name from what I just said. But if you find me afterwards, I will point you in the direction of how to find our friend's name.
Awesome.
Question.
Hi, my name is David O. I'm an associate professor of communication arts at Ramapo College of New Jersey. And the question that I have is, could you elaborate on how race and white supremacy animates the 5 Fs and the deep stories that are being told?
That is like such a great question. So I would say election fraud is a particularly great example by which we can think about the role white supremacy plays in constructing both the 5 Fs and why these deep stories are so powerful in activating the white community very, very easily. So faith in particular, and I actually have I have a report with, what is their name? I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh, why am I forgetting their name? They're an amazing organization looking at immigration. Define America. So Define America, Divine American. So Define America has a fantastic report that I was able to do with them, where we looked at what we refer to as the Great Replacement Network, and we demonstrate how, and actually I also talk about this in my book as well, how a lot of these very prominent figures will come on to white supremacist shows and podcasts and talk about how their culture is being replaced and use words that are not exactly great replacement theory. And they draw on data and facts, right, to support this idea in order to claim that white supremacy is not about feelings, but it's about facts. So it is very much overlaid in this. I would say that's like entire chapter 6 is looking at this connection very, very explicitly. And just like whose freedoms are protected and whom commits fraud. And so the deep story of election fraud, as we know from W.E.B. Du Bois all the way through now, it's basically some sort of different figure. And I have some great analysis on like the 2016 election when Stop the Steal first surfaced, but then faded because Trump won, where there was a great deal of anti-Semitism, anti-immigration rhetoric, anti-Blackness. So it's effectively how others, whether that be, Black persons, immigrants, LGBTQ community, women, or other kinds of racial or ethnic minorities, or even majorities, right? In some places of the United States, are stealing elections from those who should have power, and that's effectively white Christian straight men.
We're going to go online for a couple of questions. We've got a bunch of folks.
Oh, great.
Yep. We have almost 40 people on Zoom,
Oh, hi.
and we have several questions. So I'll try to group them. There's one like really lengthy one, but really critical and interesting. So questions around like a multi-platform comparison. Like, is there a way for you to elaborate whether Google or YouTube are more exploitable than, for example, TikTok or other social media platforms when it comes to exploiting some of the data voids there? And then a set of questions here about ChatGPT and what you think is particularly exploitable here, and how might that encourage any changes in scriptural inference practices?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. I know, I'm so sad because I published the book and I was like, search isn't going anywhere. And then like ChatGPT, it's like 3 months later, I was like, oh, well. So those are excellent questions. So in terms of how cross comparisons across platforms, this is actually a new research project I'm starting. Like, how do people search for information in their real lives? I think that there is an increased significance for apps like TikTok, for voice just activated search, Siri and Alexa, and figuring out how people just talk to search. So my book doesn't get into this, but my new research will. So stay tuned for that. I do know in this research project, I looked at cross-platform when it came things to like Google versus DuckDuckGo. So oftentimes in my talks, people would be like, well, this is why I use DuckDuckGo. And I'm like, well, it's not really the point. The keywords, doesn't matter which platform you use. And actually Google has a very robust search integrity team. So they have a lot of money and they're doing a lot to try. They don't want their platform to be exploited, So while I say like, it's not about a fix, they do a lot of important fixes, right? I mean, they changed, did the Holocaust happen? That was happening on their platform. And they were like, no, well, that's not going to happen on my platform, right? And they changed it. So I think that it's easy to like scapegoat a company, but that they are making some changes. Whereas DuckDuckGo, as far as I can tell, has no such thing as a search integrity team. And so they're much easier to exploit. And I would argue we see this because we see members of the right-wing information ecosystem being like, don't go to DuckDuckGo, don't go to Google, go to DuckDuckGo. And like Breitbart even recently had an article saying that DuckDuckGo is now Google Lite and you should go to Yandex. So in terms of like cross comparisons, like Google's actually highly effective in trying to shift this pattern. It's just that it's iterative. So you can't like do a fix and be like, I'm glad we solved the disinformation. It just has to be much more continuous.
Shall we stay in the room for a bit here?
Is it Jane?
Oh, and ChatGPT, sorry, really quickly, ChatGPT is super fascinating. I haven't done any direct research on it yet because like it's so brand new. But when you feed it conspiracies, it does a great job of telling you a story. And I would argue, if anything, it's just shifting this model even more away from exploratory search and more to this like direct method of answering our questions for us. And because it doesn't provide us with any sources, and then when you ask for sources, they're like, give you sources that don't exist. I think it could further problematize that.
Hi, my name is Jane. I'm the incoming postdoc at UMass. I'm just curious about your thoughts on the role that emotion or affect may play in making, like the conservative narrative so fascinating and so appealing. And I think that might be also related to the way that search engines work, because when you were comparing about the YouTube thumbnails, it was very obvious that the left or the right wing media outlet were producing like very uniform emotions and very like anger filled. So it was more appealing just by the thumbnails. And of course, search engines kind of prioritize very emotional, engaging content. So yeah, I was curious about your idea on that.
Thank you. That's a great question. Congratulations on your post. It's always exciting when people get jobs, you know, very cool. Emotions are a huge part of the right-wing information ecosystem in two ways. One, emotions are often used as a way of pejoratizing, of speaking pejoratively, pejoratizing, I don't think that's the word, speaking pejoratively of the left, right? So they often say the left, this is, if you just go ahead and do a search, facts don't care about your feelings. There's this narrative that the hysterical, increasingly violent left is only run on emotion and feelings, and that there are no facts based on their claims. And that's why they're actually so problematic. But then simultaneously, they use fear, which is an emotion, to manipulate facts, right? So it's fascinating, right? It's like a two-pronged process of using emotion to like feminize, the left as like this hysterical, something you can't take seriously, while simultaneously very much relying on fear to make their messaging so powerful. I talk about that in this book, and I also talk about that in that Great Replacement theory paper.
Hi, my name's Thomas Crowley. I'm a sociology student. So I've been reading recently a fantastic literature review by Alice Marwick and others at UNC-Chapel Hill about like far-right radicalization online. And one of the things they talk about is, you know, kind of the issue with the concept of lone wolves, you know, the concept of the lone wolf terrorist attack and how they're often very plugged into these right-wing media ecosystems. And I was wondering if maybe you could talk a bit about how those media ecosystems respond to, you know, these like so-called lone wolf attacks. I'm reminded, and not necessarily mass shootings, I'm reminded of like libs of TikTok inciting bomb threats at children's hospitals, and then other cases like, you know, direct violent attacks.
So I can't speak about the lone wolf violent extremism though, but I do talk about in my book about amplifying like kind of lone wolves or what seem to be these very like individualized persons, and then trafficking them through the system and making them like these instant celebrities. So James Damore is one that I talk about in my book. So he was at Google and he wrote this like extremely sexist and racist internal memo, and then Google fired him. And then he was like, oh, what, you can't say free speech at Google. And then he got a op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and then he was on Fox News, and then he was at the Horowitz convention alongside, you know, Dave Rubin and Candace Owens, and then he had a PragerU video, and he was just like everywhere. And now he's like gone. I don't know where he went again. So I do think that there's this, and I would argue that's part of step 6, like making old ideas seem new by like getting in that like person du jour, right? Or you saw this with Kyle Rittenhouse, right? He was like very much amplified and taken under the wing of the right-wing information ecosystem, and an entirely different narrative was created around this person. And then they used him to effectively demonstrate those two narratives that I told you about. It's the left that's dangerous and the media is biased. And the only reason why you're not hearing these real stories is because the left is dangerous and the media is biased.
So we probably have room for one final question. We've got a hand up here.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm a PhD student here at UMass. I was wondering if you came across any instances of conservatives using the strategy of scriptural inference in images and things like advertising, promotional ads in cinema, and if that differs from using their texts in any way and then translating that into like a semiotics of images.
Ooh, I think I'm going to answer your question right, but if not, let's just talk more over lunch. But I talk about this in my book. So Prager University is like amazing when it comes to creating catchy, very highly curated content that like every single person in my study loved, regardless of their age. They were like sharing it and consuming it and loving it. And an example that I talk about in my book is I did an interview with a person who was writing about right-wing kind of radicalization. And then 2 days later, I got an ad from PragerU that said, in just 2 days, PragerU molded a conservative, quote. And then it had the author, and I was like, isn't that the journalist I talked to? And then I was like, oh, I went to the piece, like the news piece, which was effectively saying like PragerU is radicalizing people. And they had used scriptural inference, right? They had taken a sentence and then used it in their promotional material. So yeah, I don't know if that's answering your question or if you're thinking about images specifically. I guess the image specifically that I could think of, there's an image of a Black woman yelling at a police officer during a white supremacist rally, that they use that image and as a meme throughout their network to explain this is not what peaceful looks like, as though somehow there should be like peaceful discourse happening at a white supremacist rally, or like how somehow this woman, if she'd been like, excuse me, you're denying my existence, they would have been like, oh, you're right, we should like just all go home, you know? So maybe in that way, like images are being used to spread that narrative. Thank you.
Francesca, thank you so much. Let's get another round of applause, please. But really, just fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm so glad we were able to have you here. Jonathan, we want to hand the room back to you. I know that some folks are heading on with their days, and we're also joining a conference already in process.
Well, thank you once again, Francesca. I think such generative concepts that we can take forward also for the next panel. So thank you once again. So for those who are part of the Digital Politics Workshop for Asian American Politics and Issues, we have lunch served at Worcester Commonwealth Restaurant. And so as long as you follow the rest of the faculty, we can direct you how to get there. So we have a couple tables for the workshop participants. For the rest of the guests who are here, we thank you for coming, and we hope you get to join future events of the department. Thank you.